Now, this book is a must-have if you want a primer in the history of psychiatry and the discovery of the unconscious, because it is thorough and somewhat approachable. It can also serve as a primary biographical source on the main personalities that shaped this weird and strange world of consciousness exploring. So if you want to get some details on the book and hopefully encourage you to read it, stay tuned. Welcome to Biblical Occultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. If you do these things, it really helps the channel grow. And if the channel grows, I believe it will encourage people to think critically and also to love books as much as we do. Also, follow me on X and check out my merch store if you want to support the channel. Helping in any way, including the sharing the channel and that kind of thing, will help, and I appreciate it, no matter which way you choose to support what I'm doing here. Also, before we go into the content, keep in mind that I will put in the pinned comment my Amazon affiliate link, where you can check out and buy the books that I review in this channel, plus whatever you want in Amazon, and the channel gets a small percentage for it. Doesn't cost you anything, but it helps out the project, and I really appreciate it. In this episode, I'm going over the discovery of the unconscious, the history and evolution of dynamic psychiatry by Henry Ellenberger. Now, this book was published by Basic Books, Inc. in 1970. So it's been around for a while. As you can see on the screen, it is a very large book. I have a soft cover, but if you can find any edition that could work for you, content is king, and that's really what matters. And I will put it in my list of books as well on Amazon. Now, going through this book was indeed somewhat of an ordeal because of its huge size, and the content is also dense. It's not a very easy book to read if you're not familiar with academic books. Now, I wouldn't call this the most technical book ever on the topic, but I would say it is a standard work, or at least it used to be, for those that entered into the world of psychiatry, and I still consider it to be an important primer on the topic. It really gives you a good background on psychiatry itself, its story, and to do this, it obviously requires you to go way back to the concepts and personalities involved, and this book does just that, and it is worth taking the time to go through it. Now, to get through that background, you do have to go to the foundations of this belief system, because that's what it is, and I'll expand on that further down this review. But to get there, you must explore the antecedent roots, the basics, and they lie in exorcism, magnetism, hypnotism, and then after all these, you land in what you would call 19th century psychiatry, which leads to today. Now, as a basics lesson here, I'm going to go through some of these prior conceptions that gave meaning and conceptual foundations to psychiatry, just so that you can get an idea of the book and hopefully encourage you to read it. So first, exorcism, which obviously most of you are probably familiar with, but to simplify, it's a Christian tradition, especially the Roman Catholic version of it, in which human beings are possessed by demons, and exorcism is a methodology to extricate the demon from a person. So if you find a human being that is dysfunctional in some way, or perverted or deviant, the analysis would be whether or not the person was actually infected with some kind of demonic force, and then the purpose was to go in and extricate that demon. But the key here is, it's not only about you being possessed by some kind of aberrant behavior that is external to the person, but there's also an analysis of the immoral and sinful nature of the person being possessed. Because there was a clear belief that someone who was in a state of grace, which means that they confess their sins and they are good with God, and they're baptized and they're Christian, they couldn't really be possessed at all. It would be heretical to think otherwise. Therefore, the assumption is that if you are possessed, it means that you are a very sinful person. So that would be the first approach, to analyze and to study the person and see if their falling out of grace had something serious to do with their personality and circumstances. So as you can see, that's a prototype of the psychiatric approach. It is dealing with the personality and the traumas and issues of the person, and then how that led to the possession. Now, after exorcism, you have this phenomena of magnetism, which was obviously influenced by the scientific revolution and added a component of energetic and magnetic theories into how animals and human beings interact with reality. The magnetic sleep and the magnetizer, who was the one that was analyzing the person and trying to use that energy to get results, became key parts in the treatment at the time. So you have some sort of development, you have exorcism, and then you have magnetism, which starts utilizing a lot of the quasi-scientific theories, and I would say truly scientific, because you have both. You have a lot of these theories that sound scientifically accurate, but they're not necessarily accurate based on experiments or solid theories. So you have these two elements that exist till this day. A lot of people speak quasi-scientifically because it sounds good, but they don't really have a basis for it. At the time, you still had this. We're talking about 17th century, 18th century. After magnetism, you have hypnotism, which is the third leg of psychiatry's foundation, and it's quite known by most as well. Basic idea, there's an area of our mind that works on automatic. It can be thus influenced, for good or bad, to achieve results like curing deviant thoughts and behaviors. And to this day, hypnotism is actually used, and most occultists are familiar with it because occultists are the ones that made it very famous, and occultists still exist, and therefore hypnotism is still popular. And psychiatry still utilizes hypnotism, by the way, so it's not like something that was abandoned, like exorcism, for example. You would say that hypnotism is still alive and well. But to some theorists, hypnotism was considered to be perverse and hocus pocus of a sort, because it lent itself to a lot of imagination. Now, the reason that understanding these foundations is fundamental is to remove the mythical pretensions and beliefs of a lot of people that psychiatry is somehow pure and scientific and devoid of any superstitions or religious influence. What some would call spookcraft, which I think it's a really funny, interesting term. It is quite clear that psychiatry, because of its foundations, it's still primarily a belief system. All belief systems have what you could call scientific foundations, meaning that they have theorized, tested, retested, and concluded that they are correct based on both experience, authority, and all the other epistemological tools available to a human being, so that almost every religion can argue itself to be a technology and a science. And in the case of psychiatry, it's the same when you look at its foundations. Now, when the book arrives at the study of the actual founding fathers of psychiatry, the influence of these prior practices and their famous practitioners is clear and undeniable. So once you know that background and you go into these very important thinkers, you realize how influenced they are by them, almost like they're part of a religion. Now, the book does a great job taking you through each major thinker with a solid biography, their theories, their influences, and how they influence looking forward the other thinkers that come after. So even from that point of view, the book is spectacular. You can find one of the founding fathers of psychiatry And then he divides up his chapter into very nice charts comparing one thinker to the other, etc. Now, of all the other prior systems, obviously hypnotism was the most powerful, but he also introduces the notion of 18th century and 19th century philosophy and how it impacted psychiatry. So you have hypnotism, but then you have this additional element, which would be thinkers like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and a lot of these other great Western philosophers that deeply impacted the viewpoint, the perspective on how we should approach the mind, consciousness, ethics, etc. Now, the primary thinkers would be people like Jean-Martin Charcot, and I would say he holds the key prior to the four great fathers of psychiatry, because Charcot is really one of the first that has its own structured conception of the mind and of the unconscious. And he is, I would argue, the key to open the gate into the first actual thinker that develops his own school of dynamic psychiatry, which would be Pierre Janet. And once you get to him, then you start seeing the actual development of what we would call modern psychiatry. From him, you go to Freud, obviously very famous, then Adler, and then finally to Jung. And at least this book proposes all four of them as the primary sources of what we know today as psychiatry. Now, because of these four thinkers, and I'm not going to go through the biographical elements or anything like that because that's the whole point of you reading the book, but I will give quotes from the book about each of them because I think it will present a good general notion of their influence and their impact. So starting with Janet's view on religion, to explain how these beliefs and practices have arisen, Janet resorts to the analysis of the phenomenon of thought. Thought is an interiorized language, and, as mentioned previously, with this internalization originated the idea of a double, or spirit, existing invisibly behind the visible actions of the individual. This was also the origin of animism. Animism springs up spontaneously the moment you first learn the necessity of distinguishing between the man who talks and acts as if he were your friend and the invisible, inaudible enemy who lurks behind him. The idea of God's spirits also grew from the conduct with respect to the absent ones, a special category of the absent being the dead. But why did the God spirits come to play such an important part? Janet answers that all religions have alliances or covenants with a God, either out of fear or for the sake of moral strengthening, or because man craves direction and love. Man searches for an ideal, invisible, all-powerful, and all-comprehending director and friend, that is, a God. Here is revealed the function of religion, which is making the God speak, and according to Janet, we are not to suppose that religion ever could have persisted if the gods had never spoken. Now, this is important because, first, it's completely speculative. He is basically making a philosophical argument about how human beings develop a religious consciousness, but it's also arguing about the unconscious. The double is that unconscious, the objective, the ideal as a elevated consciousness. So it is theoretical, it is philosophical, but as you can see, he's still in the realm of metaphysics. If you really look at it clearly, it seems to be a materialistic interpretation of that. But remember that we're dealing with ethereal concepts that lie in the mind. So never forget, the psychiatry is really dealing with abstracts, not with concrete things except the results of the abstracts, which would be mental conditions and anxieties and hysterias, etc. So we're still in the realm of ideas. And this is important because most people treat psychiatry as if it's in a different realm, like biology or physics. Now, going over to Freud, who was so influential, I'm going to read also a few quotes from the book that will give you a perspective. From Janet, you see, he's already exploring the notions of the unconscious and of religion and its influence on the mind. When we get to Sigmund Freud, we go here. Quote, Freud now suggested as a hypothesis a new dual classification of the instincts, eros or eros, grouping together all forms of libidinal instincts, and the death instinct, which Freud's followers were soon to call thanatos. In that dual system, Freud seemed to postulate that the death instinct was the more fundamental. Like Schopenhauer, Freud now proclaimed that the goal of life is death, that the preservation instinct itself is one aspect of the death instinct because it protects against accidental, externally caused death in order to preserve the individual for death from internal causes. Eros, or eros, is now far more than sexual instinct. It exists in each living cell and drives the living substance to constitute larger beings. It is a postponement of death by flight forward. The death instinct is the tendency towards dissolution of living substance and return to a state of inanimate matter. The two instincts are inseparable, and life is a compromise between eros and the death instinct until the latter prevails. Freud expressed the hope that the progress of biology would make a formulation of these speculations possible in scientific terms. So in that section you can see, again, theorizing about the nature of the human being, which again is in the realm of religion and theology and philosophy. He's splitting man into two different instincts, which you can call the desire for life and the desire for death. And he goes further to argue that we are split and even dialectically opposing ourselves because there's an instinct, an inclination of even the cells themselves to seek out our own demise. And I'm obviously simplifying here, but I just want to point out that, again, this lies in the realm of religion. It lies in the realm of speculation, but it is the basis for the very nature of psychiatry, especially Freudian. Now, one more quote about Freud here. Psychoanalytic techniques may thus be considered a transformation of the old techniques of hypnotists, specially devised to defeat the underlying maliciousness of hysterics and their constant endeavor to fool the hypnotist. However, it appears that the ever-present resistance of psychoanalyzed subjects had inherited this hysterical feature. What I like about that quote, the psychoanalytic system itself, very similar to a religious system that is trying to organize the mind and utilize things like hypnotism and all these other methods to extract from people their true emotions and their true nature. Now, going over to Adler, who was very, very important also after Freud, although they're somewhat contemporary, let me read this. Quote, the basic concept is that of individuality, a term expressed both the uniqueness and the indivisibility of the human being. This is best illustrated in the foreword by a quotation of Virchow. Quote, the individual represents a unified whole of which all parts cooperate towards a common goal. End of quote. As a consequence, each isolated psychological feature of the individual reflects his whole personality. So here you can see that Alfred Adler's focus is the individual, which is very interesting because that's a huge influence in modern day psychiatry as well. And his school, individual psychology, still exists. So keep that in mind. And further down in the book, the author gives a very cool chart in which he compares Freud and Adler's psychiatry. And I want to just give you a few that I think are fascinating. Freud follows philosophical pessimism, Adler, philosophical optimism. Freud, the individual is divided against himself. In Adler, essential indivisibility of the individual is the key. In Freud, the basic importance of libido, its fixations and regressions are key. In Adler, much in man's sexual behavior has a symbolic meaning in relation to striving for superiority. In Freud, in psychoanalytic therapy, the patient lies on a couch. In Adler, during Adlerian psychotherapy, the patient sits in front of the therapist. The point of the whole quote was, again, to show that you have almost opposite theories. So you have the same basic philosophical presuppositions, but they're approached differently, almost like there's different sects of the same cult. Now, going over to Carl Gustav Jung, very important, very popular, still to this day, just like Freud and Adler. But there's a twist to Jung that has been very powerful and impacted a lot of people. So let me give a quote from the book. In the summer semester of 1897, Jung gave a talk entitled A Few Thoughts About Psychology. Jung deplored the current lack of interest in metaphysics. Quote, when the normal man fancies that nothing metaphysical ever occurs in his life, he forgets one metaphysical happening, his death. End of quote. Death has always been the starting point for transcendent hopes, and these hopes postulate the existence of the soul. The task of a rational psychology is to demonstrate the existence of a soul. The soul can be conceived as an intelligence independent from time and space. Somnambulism was invoked as an argument against the prejudices of materialism. Here you can see the impact of Jung's approach to metaphysics and his re-injection of religious motifs into psychiatry. Again, it was always there, but Jung was very overt about it, which got him separated from the Freudian sect, and he founded his own school. But as you can see, in no place here is religion considered to be antithetical or external to the system. And even those systems that consider religion to be problematic, like in the Freudian system, it still sustains most of its elements, which is what I find interesting about psychiatry in the first place. So, without going too far into this review, because it can get pretty long just because of the topic, and without giving too much away from the book, the whole perspective connects psychiatry with classic shamanism. And I always like to say that psychiatry is a religion dressed up in modern scientific robes. If you follow that thread, it is quite clear that, again, you have the metaphysical theorizing and philosophical speculations that build into a theory of the mind, of the soul, of the unconscious, and of human behavior. And this became an actual system of belief with very set axioms and presuppositions. And then within this system, you have schools of thought and different sects that could even disagree on primary objects, but the basics are the same. That's why I always say that psychiatry is a religion, which is fine. I find religions to be interesting. And I would even add other systems that utilize psychiatry and metaphysics to create their own religious methodologies. They do exist aside from psychiatry itself, like Scientology, for example, which uses as a basis many of these concepts. And I see a lot of people in psychiatry critiquing that religion, but I would argue that there's not really much of a justification to do so because the foundations are almost identical. And even if you argue that the methods are not very well researched and scientifically sound as fill in whatever sect they belong to, I still think that once you mix a lot of these ideas together, including occultism, then I think it is very justifiable to see them all as religious systems, including Christianity and other systems which have a psychology already in there and have methods of curing the mind and curing the soul and philosophically harmonizing concepts, etc. So again, I'm not criticizing psychiatry. I think it is an interesting and legitimate way of addressing human beings. What I'm saying is that it should not be treated as if it's outside or external or somehow privileged outside of metaphysical systems and religions. I think that would be false, and I think that would be disingenuous. And this book gives you a really good perspective on that, and it allows you to grow in your knowledge of the topic. So hopefully you enjoy the review and encourages you to get the book and think about these things. And again, the whole point of this channel is to give my perspective on things. And obviously you have the right to disagree and to think I'm wrong or to think I'm right. It is what it is. My job is to tell you how I see things and be very straightforward and transparent about it. And if you want to put your own opinions, I love reading them. I don't mind it. Put it in the comments. and I'll be more happy to read them and interact with you. So please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. I really appreciate you doing all these things. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.